This is a race card from Salisbury from the 8th of July 1920, the third day of their three-day meeting. I already put up race card from 7th of July yesterday. I'm afraid I don't have race card from 6th of July, but I do have these two other race cards. It's difficult to read the first horse on the race card. I'm afraid it's just as simple as a 100-year-old race card, and it's slightly faded. It's actually Dickon, who I stated won a race the day before, but he didn't win today. Powder Blue won this race. In yesterday's video I stated the weather conditions were dismal, and that was when I quoted the angry special correspondent from the Western Mail. The conditions got no better this day, and the Scotsman journalist reporting on the meeting stated that attendance suffered and the paddock became a quagmire, but the course didn't wide as holding as might have been expected. They wrote that Powder Blue outstayed his rivals in the heavy ground, and Powder Blue was ridden by Ted Gardner, who won the 1922 Oaks 1923,000 guineas and was Irish champion jockey in 1936. He was trained by Pat Hartigan, who was no relation to Frank Hartigan, who mentioned in yesterday's video had trained the winner that day. Pat Hartigan had lost her eye fighting during World War I. The owner is Mrs. McGusty. She was present along with Pat Gardner and his wife when Ted Gardner got married in December 1920. Tragically, Pat Hartigan was killed in March 1921 when only 37 years old due to an accidental fall out of a hotel window, which his widow felt had been exacerbated by his war injury and just lost his sort of spatial judgment. AA won this race. Now this wouldn't be a allowable name now. I mentioned about another horse in yesterday's video, and initials only are not allowed in a horse race name. I mentioned ESB in the past, whose initials come from the horse's names of its sire and dam. In this case of AA, as both its sire and dam being A, so we'll call the horse AA. Well, you couldn't do that now. The owner was Mrs. S. Whitburn. The trainer was Captain P.A.O. Whittaker. That's Percy Whittaker. He had been champion amateur jumps jockey in 1907 and 1908, and as a trainer, his horse Silver was owned by the composer Sir Edward Elgar, and at some point won 8 races in a row, including the Troy Town steeplechase. Comments I'll include a link to a photograph of Whittaker and Sir Edward Elgar, and also a link to a painting by Sir Alfred Munnings of Whittaker on his horse Silver. The jockey of AA was Steve Donoghue, who was champion jockey 10 times and won all the classics at least once. He won the Triple Crown twice, firstly on Ponham in 1950 and a Gay Crusader in 1917, and he's the only jockey still yet to win 2 Triple Crowns. AA had run earlier in hurdles, and he come third at the Old Hurst Park course in December 1919 and a third at the Old Manchester Racecourse in January 1920. He then come fourth at Hurst Park again in January, and then won at Sandown later in January. Then second at Warwick in February, and third in a new race at March's Cheltenham Festival called the County Handicap Hurdle, which is still in existence as part of the Cheltenham Festival nowadays. Later in the year, on the flat, he finished second in handicap at Royal Ascot in June, and again fourth at Ascot later in the month. At the end of the season, this time we're back over jumps, finishing third in the Christmas Handicap Hurdle at Kempton's usual Boxing Day meeting that year, as often was held in the 20th century, on the 27th of December, as on certain occasions Boxing Day will be on a Sunday, and there's no racing allowed on Sunday until 1992, and so we see sometimes a King George and the Christmas Hurdle ran on the 27th of December, and the Christmas Handicap Hurdle was eventually replaced by a current Grade 1 Christmas Hurdle ran at Kempton. In 1921 on the flat, he finished second at Catterick in September, and then the final day of the season, on November the 26th, he finished second at Lingfield. In 1922, his only race of any type was an unplaced effort over hurdles at Windsor in January. In 1923, again he only ran over the jumps and was unplaced in his 3 efforts that year. Horse named Charlie's Uncle is an obvious reference to play Charlie's Aunt, which is already in existence then. And the name Watergate would have probably not meant that much at the time to anybody, just a horse name. But since the Watergate scandal in the early 70s, there's a lot of horses around the world have been named Watergate after the Richard Nixon scandal. There's also been quite a few horses named Highlander, so there's certainly not only one. And the horse Pompadour won the 1921 Nassau Stakes, having early in the season been third in that season's 1,000 guineas. Bible won the third race at 20 to 1. He won 3 other times that year and he never won afterwards. His only other placed effort was third in a maiden plate in August. As I explained in yesterday's video, certain races called the maidens in those days only required you to be a maiden at the time of entry. So I assume this is one of those races, and the entries for this Birmingham race that he was placed in August were done before Salisbury, and that was why he could enter despite winning a maiden race at Salisbury in July. The owner was Sir James Buchanan, who was a whisky baron and had owned Hurry On, winner of the 1916 St Leger. He invented black and white whisky, and later on that company used to sponsor a good quality jumps meeting at Ascot in the late 1970s. He was ridden by Frank Bullock, who I talked about in yesterday's video, and trained by legendary former jockey and trainer Fred Darling, and I'll link his Wikipedia article in the comments. The name, basically What About, I assume is pronounced that, not What About question mark. There's no way that would be allowed nowadays, as a poor commentator would probably have a heart attack about how on earth it is pronounced. Franklin won the 1921 Hardwick Stakes and the 1922 the Coronation Cup and Champion Stakes. The Yellow Dwarf won the 1921 Ribblesdale Stakes. The Fighting Fifth, and of course, you may well know the Fighting Fifth Hurdle. That's named after a nickname for the Warner-Thumberland Fusiliers of Fighting Fifth. And the hurdle race only started in 1969, so the horse name is actually really named after the Fusiliers. I'd always noticed the name Lone Wolf, a personal thing this, I just remember Lone Wolf fighting fantasy books. Race 4 and 5 are very high weights for a flat race, and that's because they're members of races for the Salisbury Club, and the same as one of the races was yesterday. What Luck is owned by W. Compton. It's listed earlier in the year as being owned in the papers also, but sometimes by J. Compton, and bizarrely the Western Daily Press has it in their list of runners at Salisbury as owned by W. Compton and in their tips as owned by I. Compton. It was ridden by P. Whittaker and it was trained by Whittaker according to the papers, so I assume that is the same person. What Luck had 5 runs on the flat in 1920 and 1 over jumps. Apart from this race, he won at Sandown in August and over hurdles at a former Folkestone racecourse in December. 1921, his sole flat race, he was 4th at Alexander Park in October, and over hurdles, he finished 3rd at Kempton in January, and then in March he won at the old Hawthorne Hill racecourse. In 1922, in January, he finished 2nd over hurdles at the old Gatwick racecourse before 3 days later winning at Lingfield. In March, he finished 3rd, winning again at Hawthorne Hill. Later in the year, he was back on the flat, winning at Sandown in June, before finishing 4th the next month at Alexandra Park. December, he was back on the jumps, winning again, this time at Sandown. January 1923, he finished 3rd in a chase at Sandown before winning at Windsor, and then finishing 2nd at Sandown. Both those races were also in January. He was 3rd at Kempton in February, and his next placed effort was towards the end of the year in November, when he was 2nd at Kempton. Then he was 2nd at Windsor in December, 4th at Hurst Park 2 days later, and then 3rd at Kempton on Boxing Day. He won a chase at Lingfield in March 1924. In 1925, he had 5 placed efforts over jumps but no wins. 4th at Hurst Park in February and also 4th at Sandown in March. He was 2nd at Sandown in April, and what is now the Bet365 Gold Cup Day, formerly called the Whitbread Gold Cup for many decades. And there's actually a 3x5 handicap chase in 1925 at Sandown, so that may be the predecessor race that maybe was brought back. He was 3rd in Hawthorne Hill in October and 3rd at Kempton in December. By 1926, he was owned and trained by Mr. G.G. Hymans. And finished 2nd at Lingfield as favourite in March. He was also favoured at Lingfield later on in March, where the correspondent of the Scotsman joked that he had lived up to his name of What Luck by coming to challenge and cheering his backers before losing his place. He ran next week at Lingfield only to live up to his name again, and he was brought down. In March 1927, he was owned, trained and ridden by Cecil Laglands. In March, he won a selling chase at Sandown on Imperial Cup Day in March. This is Mr. Lagland's first winner over fences, and he was bought What Luck for 212 guineas. The Western Mail said What Luck had been tubed, which means a small hole was cut in the neck to help with breathing problems. This has been banned in British racing since 2012. The most well-known horse I can think of who was tubed was Party Politics after his 1992 Grand National win, when his form started to tail off, and it did actually, frankly, I think, improve the horse's form. But Scotsman reported it appears Mr. Laglands rebought the horse for much less money this time round. Tragically, What Luck broke his back, falling at the first fence at Lingfield Park in 1928 while being ridden by Cecil Laglands. The pony won the 5th race. In 1920 he was also second on the flat at Folkestone in June, and then over jumps he was also second at Cheltenham in November. In 1921 he only won over the jumps, and in January he was second at the former Birmingham racecourse, and then 2 days later was third at Windsor. Later on in the year, in December, he was 4th, and in 1922 he won at Lingfield in January, and then finished 3rd at Cheltenham in November. In 1923 he won twice over jumps without being placed. His owner and trainer was Fred Platt, who rode the winner of an 1895,000 guineas and trained the winner of a 1911,000 guineas. The jockey is Harry Cottrell, who later as a trainer won the 2,000 guineas and the Oaks. In 1919 he was owned by James White. The Scotsman correspondent was very blunt before he won at Birmingham in June, stating he had no fancy for the horse. He finished 5th of 5 there, and is listed in some papers as being owned by today's owner Fred Platt, and in some papers has still been owned by James White. However, in future races during the year of 1919 he is still being listed as being owned by James White. He had some placed efforts, but I don't believe he won in 1919. He was definitely reported that Fred Platt picked him up in November. Tom's last is listed in the declarances. There's a possibility, and this horse, as I mentioned in yesterday's video, had a win then. The horse didn't run. Both Hanway and Palmer's Hill are listed in 2 races, as I said over times. But this is before overnight declarances from March 1961, so you're never sure whether a horse is going to win or not, and so sometimes horses can be in 2 races. Deccan won this race. In 1920 she had 2 runs over jumps and a huge 17 runs on the flat. She started in March at the Old Lincoln Racecourse, finishing 4th on the day of the Lincolnshire Handicap. She then won at Doncaster in May and was 2nd at Lingfield later in the same month. She came 2nd at Alexandra Park in July, and then at the Old Lewis Racecourse also came 2nd in August. Later in August she was 3rd at Gatwick, and was 4th in October back at Alexandra Park, and 2nd at Warwick in November. She won 4 times on the flat in 1921, with her only placed effort being the opening race of the British Flat season, when coming 4th from Brockleby Handicap at the Old Lincoln Racecourse in March. It is not the same race as the Brockleby Stakes, which by then had been converted into a 2-year-old race as it is now after being transferred to Doncaster when Lincoln closed. Deccan did not run in 1922 and only ran once in 1923 when placed in the Plumpton Hurdle in January. Deccan's owner was Mr. R. Carvalho, and she was trained by either Mr. R. McNaughton or Mr. Killerley. The Globe of the Day says it's McNaughton who had trained her later in the year, while Ross Guide to the Turf at year's end says it's Killerley who trained her earlier in the year. The jockey was Vic Smythe, who I mentioned in yesterday's video. It doesn't look like she had a win in 1919, although she did run. What a Luck is listed in this race as well, but the horse's only run that day was a win the horse had earlier on.